Today we're going to be building a live chat application using AWS Amplify and Next.JS. Here's a quick preview of what we're going to be building. We'll be using AWS Amplify Subscriptions to render live updates to the database as they come in through our GraphQL API. We'll also be using AWS Amplify's user authentication to sign up and log in users, and also to make authenticated requests on the server side to our GraphQL API. If this sounds like something that you're interested in, I would encourage you to watch this video and also consider hitting the subscribe button as well as the like button. It really helps out my channel, and I'm going to be coming out with more and more AWS Amplify and Next.js content in the near future. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. There are two prerequisites that you'll need in order to get started. You'll first need an AWS account, and the second thing you'll need is the AWS Amplify CLI installed. If you don't already have these, go ahead and make an AWS account and then run npm install -g at AWS Amplify CLI. Then link this CLI to your AWS account by running amplify configure. To create a Next.js project, run npx create next app and the name of your application. Then change directories into that newly created directory and type code dot to open it up in Visual Studio Code. For our application, we're not going to be needing Next.js API routes, so we can go ahead and delete the API folder and all of its contents. Then I'll go ahead and just delete all of this boilerplate code and replace the index.js to just return a hello world. Since this guide's not focused on CSS, I'm just going to create these 3 CSS files, and I'd encourage you to copy the CSS from the source code in the description. The first one is going to be the global CSS. This is Next.js's global style sheet. It's going to be CSS that's used across all of our pages. The second one I'm going to create is home.module.css. This is a CSS that's going to style our home page, and the third one is called message.module.css, which we're going to be using later in a component to style the way our messages look. With that out of the way, let's get started with AWS Amplify. To use AWS Amplify, we'll need 2 packages. The first one is AWS Amplify, and the second one is AWS Amplify UI React. To initialize a new Amplify project, we'll run amplify init. This command is going to kickstart a new Amplify project in our current directory, and we're going to go ahead and configure it like this: live chat for the name, dev for the environment, Visual Studio Code for the editor, JavaScript for the type, React for the framework, dot for the source, build for the distribution, npm run build and npm run start for the commands, and we're going to be using the AWS profile as the method of authentication. Now we're ready to add some Amplify features to our application. For this project, we're going to be using AWS Amplify's Authentication and GraphQL API. Since we'll be using authentication to make verified requests to our GraphQL API, we can actually configure them both just by running amplify add API. You can follow along with these configuration settings as well. We'll use GraphQL for the API type, live chat for the name, and we want Amazon Cognito user pools to be the default authorization type for the API. We'll use the default configuration and allow users to create a username that they can sign in with. We don't have an annotated GraphQL schema, so we'll just use the simple to-do default one. We can open up and edit that schema now by accepting yes for the last question. We've just configured a GraphQL API with a simple to-do schema, as well as set up Amazon Cognito to allow users to create and sign in accounts, as well as make authenticated requests to our GraphQL API. Let's go ahead and edit this schema now. Since this is a pretty simple application, we only have one model in the schema, which is a message. So we'll create a type for the message, adding the app model tag and creating 3 fields: ID, owner, and message. By setting app model, we're telling AWS Amplify to create a table for all of our messages in a new DynamoDB database. We're also telling AWS Amplify that we want an entry into that database for each message that gets created. We'll also add the auth tag. By setting the auth tag and defining allow private as the only rule, we're saying that only signed in users can create, read, update, and delete messages. So anyone who doesn't have an account and isn't signed in won't be able to contribute to our chat application. To deploy all of this infrastructure to the AWS cloud, run amplify push. We'll use these settings to generate all of the possible queries, mutations, and subscriptions from our GraphQL API. Say yes to generate all of the newly created GraphQL code, as well as JavaScript for the language. Just accept the defaults for the rest of the options. This will take a few minutes since AWS Amplify is going to convert all of our configuration into AWS infrastructure. Once that's done, we'll come back to our application and connect it on our front end. We'll be using Next.js's custom app in _app.js to configure our global CSS as well as configure AWS Amplify everywhere in our application. You can think of _app.js as a wrapper around every page. So in this file, we're going to import Amplify as well as our config and run amplify configure AWS config and set SSR to true. Now let's go to our index.js and set up an authentication form for users to create and log into their accounts. First thing we'll need to do is import with Authenticator from AWS Amplify UI React. We'll change our export default function home to just function home, and then down the very bottom of the file, we'll change it to be export default with Authenticator home. This is AWS Amplify's higher order component with Authenticator. It'll check if the user is signed in before displaying the component, and if they aren't, it'll display a login form. We can check this out by going back to the command line and running npm run dev and visiting localhost 3000. We're faced with a pre-built AWS Amplify sign-up form. I'm going to go ahead and create and verify my account through this form. Now users can sign in. I'm going to set up the basics of the chat box. The chat box is just a simple form with an input and a submit button. For now, we'll just handle the submit by console logging whatever the user typed in, and we'll come back to this later. Initially, we want to get all of the existing messages from the chat box and display them to the user. We can pre-render all of the existing messages using getServerSide props from Next.js. We'll be using getServerSide props to make an authenticated GraphQL request on the user's behalf on the server side, and then pass that list of messages that we get as props to our main component. If the user isn't signed in, we'll just return an empty list of messages. We'll also store the current signed in user with a useState and useEffect call. We can easily grab the current user from our AWS Amplify Cognito instance by calling auth.currentAuthenticated_user. Whilst we're up here, we'll create a state variable to store all of our messages. This is because we're going to be adding to this list as live updates come in shortly. We'll initialize it by spreading the props passed in of the original messages returned by getServerSide props. If you want to test out and create some dummy data, you can do that in the AWS AppSync GraphQL playground. You can access that by typing Amplify Console API, then signing into the account that you created on our front end and making some create message mutations. Now we have all of our existing messages. Let's go revisit our form. We'll create another state variable to store whatever the user is typing in the input box. We'll add an onChange handler to set that state variable every time a change is made in the input and modify our existing handle submit button to make a mutation to our GraphQL API. This mutation is gonna send off the message text that the user typed in as the message field, and for the owner field, we'll grab the current user from state and get their username to set it as the owner. We'll first sort all of our messages in state and then map over them, convert them into a new component that we're going to create called the message component. This message component is going to accept two props. The first one is going to be the actual message, and the second one is a prop called isMe. This is a Boolean flag to detect whether we, the signed in current user, are the owner of that message. So we'll create a folder called components, and in that folder create a message.js. We'll set the code of that message.js to just be a simple div that has different styles depending on whether the isMe flag is true or false. I'm also using a simple p tag to contain the contents of the actual message with message.message. Now here's where the magic happens. We'll go back to index.js and we'll add an AWS Amplify subscription. This subscription is going to listen out for live events on our GraphQL API. So we'll subscribe to the onCreateMessage GraphQL operation and passing the new message inside the value variable onto the end of our existing state messages. This way, every time a new message comes through, it gets appended into state, which will trigger a re-render and then show our new message on the UI. Now there's only one small problem that we need to fix. And that's when a guest becomes a new user, they won't be served the existing messages because they weren't authenticated on our server-side request in getServerSide props. We can solve this by creating another useEffect that listens for when the user state variable changes. This means that when the user goes from null to a user value when they sign in, we can make a regular GraphQL API query to get back all of the existing messages from our database and chucking all of those messages into the state messages variable. And that should be it. we now have a live updating server-side rendered authenticated live chat application in just under 10 minutes. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button and consider subscribing if you're interested in seeing more serverless content or topics like AWS Amplify, Next.JS, and TypeScript, because I'm going to be coming out with a bunch more videos very soon. Thank you so much for watching.